All right, now we're getting into the good stuff. We're going to be looking at the prokaryotes, the important species of prokaryotes, mainly that cause human disease, and followed by chapter 12 and 13. We'll have covered pretty much the microorganisms that we're going to be dealing with in this whole course. And then we'll go on from there to look a little closer at um, the different body systems and the diseases these organisms cause. All right. There's a real bad actor. Causes more different diseases than probably any other genus of microorganism, Streptococcus. We'll be seeing quite a lot of that one. Um, so we're going to be looking at prokaryotes. Ignore the archaea over here on the right-hand side. Bacteria, and we'll be looking at a whole bunch of gram-negative bacteria, mainly proteobacteria, they're called. There's a couple of non-proteobacteria gram-negative species. Then we'll be looking at gram-positive bacteria, and we're going to divide those into two camps. Ones that have a high percentage of guanosine and cytosine, guanine and cytosine in their genome, and ones that have a low percentage in their genome, just as a way to classify. We'll be looking at lots of subclassifications. So let's take a look. Firstly, at some gram-negative bacteria, proteobacteria. And that's the main gram-negative bacterial classification we'll be looking at. Chemoheterotrophs. I'm going to look briefly at alpha proteobacteria because, well, you'll see. Real quick, they're used for inserting plasmids into plant cells, oftentimes for genetic modification of plants. And then changes can be made that are very beneficial. Some alpha proteobacteria are nitrogen fixers, and it turns out that they produce or capture all of the nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into forms that all the rest of the living organisms on Earth can use. No other organisms can use nitrogen gas straight from the atmosphere. These guys can get it and fix it, meaning convert it into forms that nitrates and ammonia that other organisms can use. So that's pretty big. Even though it's not a disease-causing thing, I thought I should mention it. And there you can see some of these specialized nitrogen-fixing bacteria forming these little nodules on the roots of various pea and bean plants. You've probably known about those. Soybeans, for example, are good for soil because they do that kind of thing. Alfalfa. Anyway, nitrogen fixers. Another just point of interest by some alpha proteobacteria, not that much of our interest. However, here we come to some really, really important disease-causing bacteria. What I want you to do is take a look. I have put on the Moodle page a Word document that has an outline of all of these bacteria. And what I want you to do is learn the bacteria in the different classifications and just one or two little snippets about each one. We'll fill in more later, but I want you to know, what is Bartonella known for? What's the thing about it? It's cat scratch disease, transmitted by cats. It causes flu-like symptoms that may last for a month or more. So it's this lingering flu-like disease, cat scratch disease. Brucella causes a disease called brucellosis. It's a disease that comes from working around livestock. It's called relapsing fever or undulant fever. Undulation means to swing back and forth. So there's this fever where you keep on feeling better, then you get the fever, then you get better, then you get the fever. It's transmitted in milk oftentimes. So when we don't get this, we probably never heard of it because all of the milk that is sold legally is checked for various bacteria such as Brucella. It's a very important microorganism. All right. Obligate intracellular parasites. This group down here at the lower half of this page, they're all spread by arthropod vectors. That's the way they're transmitted. So Rickettsia prowazekii cause what's called typhus. It's a very serious disease with a pretty high mortality and morbidity rate. It's transmitted by body lice. So when you have large populations of people that are sort of ensconced in an abnormal location where they're in close proximity to each other and don't have access to good hygiene and so forth, such as armies that are in a foreign location or on the move in trenches, whatever, refugee camps, there's a possibility of outbreak of typhus. Um, Rickettsia typhi, which is spread by rat fleas. It causes what's called epidemic murine typhus. So in a place where there's a lot of mice cohabitating with people, the mice carry fleas. The fleas get infected with this bacteria and can cause an epidemic or cause a lot of incidence of disease. Endemic means with it's common in the population or the region. Rickettsia rickettsii causes what's called Rocky Mountain spotted fever. A little bit of data right there about what's its deal. Transmitted by ticks. So ticks in that mountainous climate, as people traveled westward, and as the populations moved west in this country, Rocky Mountain spotted fever became a known and feared disease. Ehrlichia is a similar related disease, different species of bacteria causes what's called ehrlichiosis, and this is a parasite that just so happens it lives in white blood cells. These are all intracellular parasites. These guys tend to infect the endothelial cells of the blood vessels, but here these guys are infecting white blood cells transmitted by ticks also. And there's a little picture of Rickettsia bacteria with a big slime layer around the outside of it. Here's a bunch of Rickettsias inside of a host cell. In this case, it's being grown in chicken embryos. Oh, there I go. Um, um, so let's just a quick look at the ones, just a little flow chart of some of the properties of the ones we've just been talking about. Um, we wouldn't look at anything on the right-hand side of this chart because we're not going to interest ourselves in Wolbachia, for example, which is probably the most ubiquitous bacteria that infects and plagues insects and so forth. Um, all right, beta proteobacteria. Bordetella pertussis causes what's called whooping cough, and that's a disease that was a big problem and caused a high mortality rate in children until vaccines were introduced. Before vaccines were introduced, um, and before some of the better antibiotics we have now came along, it was about something like 20% of children never reached the age of 5 years old in this country because of all the different diseases, including whooping cough. So it's some very serious stuff we're talking about here, and some great breakthroughs having vaccines for these ages. Again, we don't hear about it much because everyone in this country, as many as possible anyway, are vaccinated against Bordetella pertussis. Burkholderia, the sort of claim to fame of this one is people with cystic fibrosis get pneumonias and lung infections repeatedly throughout their shortened life. And it's because they have mucus in their respiratory system that's abnormal and it's so viscous they can't sweep it up and out to be swallowed into the stomach. And so the mucus is stationary or static, and bacteria get in there and just start colonizing the lungs and causing disease over and over. And oftentimes when they finally succumb, it'll be to a species of Burkholderia bacteria. Neisseria species. Neisseria are gram-negative cocci. So Neisseria gonorrhea are diplococci that are transmitted by sexual activity for the most part. They have fimbria that allow them to attach to epithelial cells in the pharynx and in the urogenital system. So they get into there during sexual activity and they start growing. Gonorrhea, I'm sure you've heard of. Very, very common sexually transmitted disease. Now they don't want to call it STDs. It's kind of a I don't know, a connotation or bad feelings. Now they call them STIs, sexually transmitted infections, whatever. Neisseria meningitidis, um, that's not the right pronunciation, meningitidis. There's another bacteria I was mixing it up with. It's pronounced meningitidis. Um, no, I think that was actually right. I can't remember. Pronunciation, by the way, is a big problem when talking about bacteria, and I have to look them up all the time. If you Google Bacterial Pronunciation Station. There's a website that I think is from St. Louis University. I'm not sure, but one of the universities puts out a list of virtually all the pathogenic bacteria with hot links so you can click and listen to pronunciations of the names. And that'll save you some difficulty. Anyway, more diplococci again, and these guys are known for causing meningitis, a disease where the meninges, the coverings of the brain and spinal cord, get infected with these bacteria, gets all in the cerebrospinal fluid, and it's a very fast-moving lethal disease if you get it. So very frightening kind of a thing. Spirillum. Spirillum bacteria are rigid, corkscrew-shaped bacteria. They can be acquired by drinking stagnant water. So if you're out camping and traveling, most of you probably know, but you do not drink the water for one of the reasons of which spirillum bacteria could be in there and cause disease. We'll discover some protozoa that are relatively uncomfortable that come along from contaminated water as you're out hiking in the mountains and whatnot that you wouldn't want to drink. Bordetella pertussis, infecting some epithelial cells in the respiratory system. Here's a Neisseria gonorrhea diplococcus, all of its flagella. Here's a spirillum bacterium, this corkscrew-shaped stiff guy. All right, we come now to gamma proteobacteria, the largest classification of all the gram-negative bacteria, all the proteobacteria, and a number of important species are in here. Francisella tularensis. These are very important bacteria. They might seem obscure because you haven't heard of it, but they're very important bacteria. They're considered a potential candidate for biowarfare, weaponization. They are a problem in pet rodents and rabbits, and also in wild rabbits and other wild animals. A common host for this disease or person might be susceptible is a taxidermist who handles a lot of animal bodies. Intracellular pathogens, Legionella pneumophilia. Legionella causes Legionnaire's disease, and it tends to live in dilute water. It can live in water pipes. So if you have just the regular water plumbing to a building can become contaminated with Legionella bacteria, which can attach themselves to the walls of the pipes and occasionally give off bacteria, which can infect people who drink the water. Also, air ducts of air conditioning system in commercial buildings can become contaminated with Legionella and cause disease. The first discovery of Legionellosis, Legionnaire's disease, was during a conference of war veterans, World War II veterans, I believe, in perhaps Philadelphia. And there were these elderly gentlemen who were convening to, commemorate their experiences during wartime and their service to the country. And some of them started just dying, dropping like flies. And there was a panic, and they found that the problem was bacteria that were coming from the air conditioning system ducts, and they discovered it was Legionella. Coxiella burnetii, another very important disease-causing organism that's considered weaponizable and a biowarfare risk. It's associated with afterbirth of farm animals found all around in the barnyard dust, perhaps, where there's a farm where there's a lot of, like obviously in dairy farms, a lot of calving every year to trigger the lactation of the heifers. So Coxiella causes what's called Q fever, and it can also cause endocarditis. These bacteria can infect the inner lining of your heart, endocardium of the heart, cause very serious disease. I'm sure you've heard of cholera. It's caused by a bacterium called Vibrio cholera. It's like a curved rod bacteria. It causes a very, very severe watery diarrhea, so bad that it can very easily cause death by dehydration. You just can't ingest and absorb water fast enough to replace what's being lost out of your intestines by diarrhea. It's transmitted by fecal contamination in water. Vibrio parahemolyticus also, it's like a similar disease, only much more mild, but still no one likes to have diarrhea. It comes from fecal contamination of water, so raw sewage getting out into the water, especially into brackish water where fresh water comes out into the ocean. and the shellfish get contaminated. People consume the shellfish and get the sickness. So that's the deal with Vibrio parahemolyticus. Here's a this one should cause all kinds of ringing bells and sirens and whistles. When we say Pseudomonas aeruginosa, that is a very, very big problem bacteria, partly because it's so metabolically diverse, it can grow on or in just about anything. Disinfectants used to eliminate other pathogens from various surfaces and medical equipment, Pseudomonas can grow in it. So it's quite shocking. Um, It also can be a nosocomial infection. It can be acquired in the hospital setting. It's just everywhere. People that have severe burns often have Pseudomonas infections. You can tell because there's a blue-green pigment that's produced by these bacteria when they grow. So if you look at the bandaging of someone who has severe burns, you'll see some of this color kind of in the bandages, and it'll be because of Pseudomonas infection. Doesn't cause disease in normal healthy people. That's why we label it an opportunistic infection. There has to be something wrong. We have to damage some part of the innate immune system so that it can get into the body. Once in, then it can cause havoc. Moraxella is just a bacteria that can be present in the nasal cavity, and it can be transmitted by touch and nasal secretions and cause conjunctivitis, inflammation of the eyes. That is connective tissue covering of the front of the eyes. There's some Pseudomonas bacteria with their flagella. There's Coxiella burnetii, bacteria nasty disease. Q fever. There's some Vibrio cholera. You can see those curved. They're not truly spirilla. They're just these curved-looking bacteria. Another group of bacteria within the large collection of gamma proteobacteria is Enterobacteriales. That's an order of bacteria. There's a number of important species or genus and species within that. So let's take a look at these. They're facultative anaerobes, and they live in the intestine, hence the name enterics. Entero means of the digestive tract. So these are enteric bacteria of the digestive system, and they're facultative anaerobes. Again, that means that they can utilize oxygen and do aerobic respiration and get a lot of ATP, but they can also live happily without oxygen as anaerobic bacteria. They just can't grow as fast using anaerobic metabolism. All right, so here are some important ones. You should be able to rip these right off. Study them until you know. E. coli, right? It's the most common intestinal bacteria. We'll find out that basically E. coli and Bacteroides are the two most voluminous bacteria. They're so important for us because they outcompete pathogenic bacteria that come in our diet, the few that survive our stomach. Very important. Some can cause disease, however. Sometimes they acquire a gene which makes them disease-causing and cause gastroenteritis or worse. Salmonella enterica is a fairly bad bacteria that is transmitted to humans by animal feces. So when you eat meat, poultry, it can have some, especially it'll have some salmonella in there, maybe a very, very trace amount, in which case it wouldn't matter because you need to get a certain dose of it to actually get disease from it. If you get enough of it, though, in a particular meal, if you eat at a place where there's fairly high salmonella contamination of the food, a diner, for example, or something, then you might get sick from Salmonella enterica. Gastroenteritis means cramps, discomfort, vomiting, diarrhea, anything to do with upset of your digestive tract. Salmonella typhi is a specific serotype. That means it's the same species, it's still Salmonella enterica, but a particular strain of Salmonella enterica called typhi, and it causes typhoid fever, which is more severe, can be fatal. Generally, when you get salmonellosis, it's not fatal, but if you get the typhi, then that can be fatal, and so that's pretty serious. Hopefully, somewhere along the way later on, when we talk about digestive system diseases, we'll talk about Typhoid Mary, a famous person who transmitted Salmonella typhi to a lot of people in New York City, probably around the 19-teens, maybe 1920s. Salmonella typhi, you heard me say that. it's often how it's named. People just don't even say enterica; they say Salmonella typhi, even though technically that's incorrect. It's Salmonella enterica serotype typhi, just so you become educated. All right, Shigella is almost identical to E. coli. It causes what's called traveler's diarrhea. If you travel south of the border, if you go to Mexico or Central America, you've probably heard this before. What's the rule of thumb for staying healthy when you're traveling down south? Number one, don't drink the water unless you have a special water purification kit with you, which you should have if you do travel down there. You can buy them at the drugstore for traveling. There's special filters that filter out all microorganisms from the water, and it's a portable device that you can fill a water bottle with this special filter system repeatedly. That's one. Don't drink the water. Number two, boil it, peel it, or don't eat it. Simple as that. Or you're almost certain to experience the diarrhea and gastroenteritis of a lifetime, memory of a lifetime. Salmonella, or I'm sorry, I was meant to get down here on Shigella. Shiga toxin is the name of the toxin that can cause a pretty bad gastroenteritis, or maybe even cause a bleeding kind of a condition on the surface of your intestines. That's more severe indeed. E. coli, when they become disease-causing, oftentimes is because they acquire the Shiga toxin gene from Shigella. And so now E. coli really does look pretty much identical to Shigella, causes that kind of disease. It goes from gastroenteritis to being this much more severe disease where you'll see blood in the stool. Klebsiella pneumoniae can cause occasional pneumonia, especially in people that are already in the hospital. So it's a problem in medical settings where people are very susceptible. Their immune system is compromised by trauma, surgery, and so forth. And Serratia marcescens is another very important nosocomial agent. It's an enteric bacteria, and it's generally not a problem except in people who have compromised immune systems again, or are in a medical setting where they're exposed to larger amounts of it than usual. It's an interesting microorganism in that it grows with a bright red pigment. So you'll see the colonies when you study it. I'm sure you'll study it in the laboratory if you haven't already. You'll see these bright red colonies, very cool looking. Proteus vulgaris has a very highly motile bacteria, causes wound infections as well as UTIs. Most of these bacteria are enteric bacteria that many of which don't cause disease normally, but if they're allowed a portal of entry, it's called, into your body, they move in out of the GI tract into some other part of your body, other compartment, then they cause disease. And that's what we're talking about here. You get a UTI or wound infection from Proteus. It shouldn't be in either one of those locations. Although, whereas Shigella, of course, is nasty at all times. Yersinia pestis causes bubonic plague. It's the bacteria of all the horrible plagues that killed a large fraction of the population of Europe during the Middle Ages and different times in history. Quite terrible. So it's still a problem in the Southwest to some degree. We hear about it. Occasionally a case of bubonic plague, even today. Enterobacter cloacae causes UTIs. So these are some important gamma proteobacteria you should be able to know off the top of your. When you hear any of these names, you should immediately be able to identify it as Enterobacteria, Enterobacteriaceae, and being a facultative anaerobic gram-negative bacillus. All right. Pasteurellales, another order. Pasteurella can cause pneumonia and septicemia. Septicemia is a bad infectious condition that people get towards the end of life when they're very, very badly traumatized, struggling for survival in the ICU and things like that. Haemophilus influenza is a species of bacteria that was discovered, I may have mentioned this before, it was discovered during a time when the scientific community was trying to find the basis for the 1918 epidemic, which we later found out was caused by influenza virus. It was a very bad, virulent species of or type of influenza virus, the 1918 influenza, but they initially thought maybe they had discovered it when they found this bacteria, Haemophilus influenza, and the name has just stuck. The claim to fame for this one, in order to culture it, it needs heme from blood, and it needs NAD and NADP to be given to it. It can't synthesize these things. They're called X and V factors that have to be added to the media. Whatever media you grow these on has to have those particular supplements. Haemophilus ducreyi causes a sexually transmitted disease. Chancroid causes genital sores, very characteristic looking genital sores. When we talk about the urogenital system, we'll probably look at some very dainty looking pictures of such lesions on the skin. Okay, so that's the gamma proteobacteria, that largest group. Then we come to epsilon proteobacteria, Campylobacter jejuni. Now, there's not too many species in the epsilon proteobacteria, but I would like to point out that Campylobacter jejuni is a animal feces to human oral consumption of food kind of transmission mechanism, and it's considered to be the #1 cause by frequency of quote-unquote food poisoning. When you get the so-called 24-hour bug, there's no 24-hour bug. If you get a 24-hour bug, it means you got food poisoning. You ate probably some fecal bacteria from an animal that was from, say, a food prepared in a restaurant or from somewhere you bought it where it was contaminated, and so you got an overgrowth of this bad bacteria in your intestines, and so for a day you got gastroenteritis, and then it went away because it kind of passed most of those bacteria on through. Very common problem for food poisoning. Helicobacter pylori is a species of bacteria that's the most common cause of peptic ulcers, stomach ulcers, gastric ulcers, and it can lead to stomach cancer. So it's pretty serious, but generally people that have stomach ulcers, they have quite a lot of discomfort, and they'll be diagnosed and treated with antibiotics to kill these bacteria. For many, many years, it was believed that people that had gastric ulcers just had too much acid in their stomachs. They were worriers, perhaps, and so people told them to settle down, will you? Just don't take things so seriously. Get a new job, or you're not so stressed. You'll be fine. When in fact, the poor souls really had an infection with Helicobacter pylori. It colonizes the lining of the stomach and allows the stomach acids to get past the mucus lining of the stomach and onto the tissue and start damaging the tissue. And there is some these nasty bacteria. Okay, we have a few more gram-negative bacteria that are not part of the proteobacteria. So cutting off, we've been talking about proteobacteria right straight through. Now we'll talk quickly about chlamydias. Chlamydias are intracellular parasites, obligate intracellular parasites. They cannot reproduce outside of a host cell, and they have an interesting complex life cycle. Chlamydia trachomatis is the most common cause of sexual transmitted disease. So it's a very big problem. It's everywhere in areas where there's a lot of unprotected sex and so forth, and it can cause blindness. It can cause some pretty serious complications. Chlamydophilus psittaci is associated with bird droppings, especially pigeon droppings like in the city, and it's an opportunistic pathogen. So people that have immunocompromise, if they happen to live in the city, have to be careful about going to the park and getting around the birds because they can get psittacosis. They can get a serious infection with these guys. Chlamydophila pneumoniae can cause, obviously, pneumonia, given its name. Let's look at the life cycle of these things. Very interesting, unusual for bacteria. So here we have some a chlamydia growing inside of a host cell. We said they're obligate intracellular parasites, and there's these reticulate bodies inside the cells that are dividing, and then they convert over to what's called elementary bodies. They're a simpler, more seed-like structure. These elementary bodies eventually burst out of the cell and then go infect other cells. They're the infectious agent, and they can bind to the surface of other cells and then be taken up by endocytosis. Then they convert back to a reticulate body in a vesicle or vacuole and then start multiplying. So that's the life cycle of chlamydias or chlamydophilus. All right, spirochetes. 3 important spirochetes. Treponema pallidum causes syphilis, and that's obviously a bad sexually transmitted disease. Can be fatal, can cause nervous system damage, psychosis, all kinds of problems, but it can cause all kinds of organ damage throughout the body, long-term disease. Borrelia burgdorferi causes Lyme disease. It's transmitted by ticks, deer ticks. So there's, I believe it's mice that carry fleas, which can infect the deer, which infects the ticks. You can look up the life cycle. I haven't reviewed that chapter again yet to remind myself, but anyway, comes from deer ticks, which are getting more and more prevalent in the northeast part of the country. I just got bitten by 2 Lyme ticks that got right into my skin last summer for the very first time around here. So they're coming. You just gotta get used to it. You just gotta check your body after you go outside in the woods, go hiking in the woods or jogging. Check your body out before you, shower up and clean up afterwards. Don't just go on about your day. Leptospira comes from animal urine. Water contaminated with animal urine, you can get leptospirosis. Again, a spirochete with that axial flagellum. Remember, spirochetes are the corkscrew ones that are flexible and have the axial filament, which is a type of flagellum, which causes them to spiral and corkscrew through the water by way of locomotion. Bacteroides are the most prevalent bacteria in your colon, along with E. coli. Lots and lots and lots of them. Harmless, they're commensals. They just live in there and hang out and outcompete bad stuff. There's a picture of a couple pictures of a spirochete. All right, so now we come to gram-positive. I'm going to speed myself up a little bit. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? Let's split this into half. I'm going to stop here and form a part 2. I've been making a little bit too long of videos, I think, so I'm going to stop here. That was all the gram-negative bacteria. Now let's look at the gram-positive bacteria in Chapter 11, Part 2.